Rain drizzled over the crowded street market, turning the dust into muddy streaks and making the old tarpaulin roofs sag under the water's weight. Among the chatter of vendors and the clatter of metal utensils, a young woman named Mira stood silently beside a tiny wooden stall. Her clothes were worn, but she carried herself with quiet dignity, shoulders straight, eyes steady, even as hunger gnawed at her like a dull blade. In her hand, wrapped in an old silk cloth, she held the only thing she had left in the world, her mother's silver pendant, a small heart-shaped locket with a faded engraving, the last piece of her family's history. Losing it felt like losing her mother all over again. But today, she had no choice. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and her younger brother back home was sick, burning with fever. Medicine cost money, food cost money, and she had none. Mira swallowed the lump in her throat and approached the jeweler's stall. The jeweler, a stout man with sharp eyes, barely glanced at the pendant before making an offer so low it almost felt insulting. "That's the best I can do," he grunted, reaching for it. Mira hesitated. The pendant seemed to grow heavier in her palm. Memories of her mother's laughter, warm hugs, and whispered bedtime stories flickered in her mind. But then she thought of her brother's pale face and trembling hands. Her fingers loosened. She placed the pendant on the counter. Just as the jeweler grabbed it, a deep, firm voice spoke behind her. "Wait, I'll take a look at it." The jeweler stiffened. Mira turned slowly and found herself staring up at a tall man in a charcoal gray coat, his presence almost commanding the air around him. His hair was neatly groomed, and his sharp features gave him an aura of authority. This was Aidan Vaughn, a billionaire investor known for his cold logic and impossible standards, though Mira didn't know that yet. He picked up the pendant with surprising gentleness, turning it in his fingers. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to something else, something sharper, almost stunned. "Where did you get this?" he asked softly, his eyes locked onto hers. Because Aidan recognized the engraving, and he knew this pendant couldn't possibly be here, unless fate had just placed something unbelievable right in front of him. A cold breeze swept through the open market as Mia stepped away from the pawn shop, the envelope of money clutched tightly in her trembling hand. It wasn't much, barely enough for a few days of meals, but it felt like a lifeline. Her mother's locket, the last memory she had of her, was gone, but survival had won over sentiment. At least for now. She headed toward a small street food stall, drawn by the smell of warm bread. Her stomach growled painfully. She hadn't eaten since the day before. She ordered the cheapest meal available, then found an empty spot on a wooden bench. As she sat down, she didn't notice the sleek black car parked across the street, nor the man whose eyes had been following her every move. Alexander Hayes, billionaire investor known for buying failing businesses and turning them into empires, watched her with a strange ache in his chest. He had seen many things in life: greed, ambition, desperation. But the look in Mia's eyes when she sold that locket, that had stopped him cold. He hadn't meant to overhear the conversation inside the pawn shop, but the door had been open. He heard the hesitation in her voice, the way it cracked when she whispered, "It belonged to my mother." He saw the way her fingers lingered on the locket one last time before letting it go, and he saw the guilt on the pawnshop owner's face as he handed her far less than it was worth. Alexander was a man who rarely felt compelled to intervene in anyone's life, but Mia, thin, exhausted, yet somehow dignified, stirred something in him he couldn't quite explain. As she ate her small meal, she kept looking at the money in the envelope, calculating, planning, worrying. He noticed the way she kept her shoulders tucked inward, as if trying to shrink from the world. She carried a quiet strength, but also a heavy burden. Alexander stepped out of his car. Mia didn't see him until his shadow fell across her bench. Startled, she looked up and froze. He was tall, sharply dressed, someone who clearly didn't belong in this rundown market. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, voice gentle but firm, "but I believe something of yours deserves to be returned." She blinked in confusion, and then he held up her mother's locket. The winter wind sliced through the narrow alleyways of the city, carrying with it the bitter reminder of how harsh life could be. Maya pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stood outside the bakery window, watching trays of warm bread being arranged behind the glass. The smell alone made her stomach twist painfully. She hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. Life had never been luxurious for her, but ever since her part-time job at the textile shop ended without warning, survival had become a daily battle. She had sold almost everything she owned, her old clothes, her little wooden table, even the small heater she used on cold nights. But now there was only one thing left, her treasure. Inside her bag, wrapped carefully in a faded scarf, was a delicate gold locket. It was small, heart-shaped, with tiny engravings along the edge. It didn't look like much, but it held the last photo of her mother, the only family she ever had. The locket had been passed down through 3 generations of women in her family. Maya had sworn she would never let it go. But hunger was unforgiving. Her fingers trembled as she took it out, staring at the worn metal that held her mother's memory. Tears stung her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mama," she whispered, brushing her thumb across the tiny photograph inside. "I don't have a choice anymore." With a deep breath, Maya walked toward an antique shop at the corner of the street. Its dusty windows reflected a world she no longer felt part of. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped in, and the shopkeeper, a gray-haired man with round glasses, looked up. "Yes," he said, unimpressed. I want to sell this," Maya murmured, placing the locket on the counter. The man inspected it with practiced eyes. "Old piece, I can give you $30. "30?" Maya whispered. "This is real gold. It belonged to my family." He shrugged. "Take it or leave it." Her stomach growled, humiliatingly loud. She swallowed her pain, nodded slowly, and accepted the money. As she stepped outside into the cold again, she felt a piece of her heart breaking. But what she didn't know was that she was being watched. Across the street, a tall man in a dark coat had seen everything, her hesitation, her tears, and the moment she handed away her most precious possession. And he was no ordinary man. He was Alexander Hale, the billionaire known across the country. And what he saw stunned him more than he expected.